If your contract doesn't have the right protections, you could lose your deposit, get stuck with expensive repairs, or overpay on a property by tens of thousands of dollars. In this video, I'll show you how to avoid all of this with 6 simple clauses every real estate investor should use in their contract. If you don't know who I am, my name is Ryan Bakey, and last year my clients collectively purchased over 300 investment properties, so I've seen a lot of these contracts and the problems that they can contain sometimes. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why drafting airtight contingencies is as crucial as picking the right property, and how clauses like Ryan Bakey and/or assign give you the flexibility to lease, sell, rent, or even repair your investment without legal headache. So I got this podcast idea from my recent event here in Chicago, and I was teaching about deal analysis. And the first thing to understand with deal analysis, deal negotiation, is you have to figure out if you're a buyer or if you're a seller, okay? Because there are teeny things you have to realize if you're a buyer and if you're a seller. First, we have to understand, is it a buyer or a seller's market, right? So if properties are flying off the market, average days on market is 15 or less, well, we know that it's going to be a seller's market, right? And so if it is a seller's market, we're not going to be able to get a whole lot of these contingencies sometimes if houses are just flying off the market, right? We're not going to get to pay nearly as little as we want to. If houses are flying off the market, we're more likely to pay more than what we want to because a lot of people are bidding and there's a lot of competition there, right? Versus if it's a buyer's market and a lot of properties are sitting there on the market, 90, 120, 150 days, well, then we're going to be able to get away with a lot of these contingencies because really just the sellers don't have any other choice, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about these. But first, I want to talk to you about knowing your local markets and metrics before you even sign the contract. You have to know in your market, right, what is the average days on market, DOM. Is it 10 days, 15 days, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 120 days? Like, what is the average days on market? You have to know that before you're ever going to be able to negotiate anything. You need to know if it's a buyer's market or if it's a seller's market, right? Let's talk about this real quick. In every negotiation, I'll give you some of my best negotiation tips. Number one, you have to figure out if you're a buyer or a seller, okay? Because if I'm a buyer, here's what I want to do. If I'm a buyer, I want to lock the property up under contract as quick as possible and have as many contingencies in there as I can. Why? Because every time something comes back, let's say I agree to a $300,000 purchase price, for example, and then I get the inspection report and I find out that the roof needs to be replaced. Well, that's a $20,000 subtraction on the purchase price. Oh, it needs electrical work. That's another $1,000. It needs plumbing. It needs HVAC. It needs all this. The price can normally only go down. It'll never go up. When you lock into a price, whether you're a buyer or seller, just remember that the price is what it is. It'll never go up, but it'll always go down. It can only go down from there, right? So as a buyer, I normally want to lock up the property as quick as possible for whatever purchase price amount, and then really save my money, whether it's I get a reduction in the purchase price or I get credits towards my down payment whenever I figure things out, right? Uncover the skunks, as they say, right? All the skunks in the deal, right? Roof, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, things about the area that don't make the deal seem too well, right? If I have all these contingencies in there, well, then I can back out. But listen, if I'm a seller, here's what I want. If I'm a seller, what I want to do is I want to lay out all the skunks on the table. I want to go to the buyer and say, hey, Mr. Buyer, you know what? The roof needs to be replaced. The plumbing, electrical could use a little work, this and this, but does $300,000 sound all right? We're going to do this contract as is, meaning that the buyer cannot go after them for any additional inspections, repairs, things like that, because the contract is as is, right? So if I'm a seller, I want to get the buyer to agree to a price along with as is. So that way when the buyer comes and discovers all these things, he or she cannot reduce the price or get concessions because they already agreed to an as is price. So if I'm a seller, I want to say all the bad things about a deal up front and get the buyer to lock into a price, right? If I'm a buyer, I want to lock into a price as quick as possible and then release and reveal all the skunks, knowing that I'll get a knockdown and a reduction in purchase price, right? So you see both sides of that coin, right? If I'm a seller, if I'm a buyer, If I'm a seller, I want to lay all the skunks on the table. If I'm a buyer, I want to uncover them one at a time, right? I lock into that contract price. Oh, this needs fixing, window, washing, all this stuff. That needs to be fixed. And so I'm either going to get a knock in the purchase price or I'm going to get money towards my down payment and closing costs, right? Let's talk about contingencies. First line of defense, inspection contingency, right? What if you discover a hidden crack in the foundation after you've locked in the deal, right? That's why inspection contingency matters. It gives you the right to cancel or negotiate if significant defects appear, and it forces the seller to disclose known issues or make those repairs. So in a state like Illinois, we have so many disclosures here. California is the same way. We have radon disclosure, natural gas disclosure, all these different things that you have to disclose when selling a house. Now, typically a inspection is going to last 7 to 14 days from when the contract's signed is when you're normally going to get the inspector in there. And that's when the period is going to be good for. Obviously, make sure you know your state's laws to see which one and which specific state you're operating in is going to have different laws, right? Real quick, if you're buying a rental property this year, I'd love to help you out. My team and I work one-on-one with real estate investors who are actively buying properties, and we help them save money on their tax bill to offset their down payment. Audrey put $60,000 down for a short-term rental, and we saved her $33,000 on her tax bill, so the IRS basically paid for half of her down payment. That's a pretty typical scenario if you're actively buying real estate, so if that's something you're interested in, then click the first link in the description for more information. Okay, now back to the video. So the scope of it, we're talking about structural, pest, environmental, we're talking about HVAC, right? Even sewer scopes. I'll give you another little tip, like in the Midwest, or anywhere where it gets all 4 seasons, I would highly recommend taking a look at where does your plumbing run out to. Obviously it runs out towards a major road, but do you have trees in between your house and that road? Because something I'll never forget is I bought a house one time where it had big trees in the yard in between where the plumbing was running and the road. And that those roots of that tree had confiscated my plumbing pipes so bad that they basically pretty much cracked, and then the sewer, everything backed up, and I had to get the pipes replaced. But those are things that I know now that I didn't know then, and something that I would definitely look at if you're buying in the Midwest, right? So just know that the inspection contingency is going to be based on your state, right? So let's say Mike found termite damage during his 10-day inspection period and used that contingency to secure a $3,000 credit for repairs before closing, right? Somebody was going to have to come in there and spend $3,000 on getting all the termites out, repairing some of the broken wood in the attic, things like that, right? Appraisal contingency guards against you having to overpaying, right? So when you're financing a property and going to a bank, the lenders are going to require an appraisal to confirm the property's value. They want to make sure that they're loaning out on something and that they could be made whole in the event that you give up that property. Without this clause, you are stuck covering the appraisal gap if it comes in below the purchase price. So let's say you lock in a property for $300,000 and the appraisal comes in at $280,000, right? Whether you do 10% down and 20% down, I guess it really doesn't matter. But in this case, let's say you did 10% down and you're going to do 10% down, so you're going to put $30,000 down, and then your plan was to get a loan for $270,000. Well, let's say the appraisal only came in at $280,000, so they only think the house is worth $280,000. So if you're going to put down $30,000, they're only going to give you $250,000 towards the loan. Now you as the borrower, you as the buyer have to come up with the additional $20,000. That's what we call the appraisal gap, right? So what the appraisal contingency allows you to do is define the minimum accepted appraised value, right? That's going to be that floor. That's going to be what the bank determines that the value is. If it's low, then there's going to be some sort of renegotiation window in the appraisal contingency, right? So I've actually had that to my help, especially in a buyer's market where the seller doesn't really have a lot of opportunities. If you lock in a property for $300K and the appraisal comes in at $285 or $290, sometimes the seller, they're nice enough and they'll just be like, oh, you know what, we'll come down on the purchase price. Because as a buyer, I have to go, look, I have to come out of pocket an extra 10 grand. I don't have 10 grand, but if you're willing to, if you could lower the contract price by $10,000, then I can close on that loan, right? So sometimes you can renegotiate and get a lower price if you don't meet that appraisal gap, right? Or you just back out of the contract. The appraisal contingency allows you to back out of the contract if it's not going to work out for you, right? So here's another little sneaky one that a lot of people don't know about, but it's definitely saved me a time or two, and that's called the financing contingency. So the financing contingency allows you to, if you do not get the loan that you thought you were going to get, you are able to back out of the contract, right? So let's say you go under contract on a property and you have a 45-day close, 60-day close maybe. I wouldn't recommend longer than 60 days. And then all of a sudden interest rates go up, right? Interest rates shoot up 0.5%, 1%, throws your debt to income off completely, right? Well, what do? You're already locked in to the contract. You have to close on the home. You have to go get an inspection. You have to go get an appraisal. You have to do all these things. But what happens to your earnest money? What happens to your deposit, right? You've already put that down. Well, if you don't get the financing that you want, are you able to back out? Well, with a financing contingency, you are, right? So the way that that works is when you write up the contract, you can write up the contract subject to a certain interest rate with said bank, right? So I could write in there subject to a 6.5% interest rate with Wells Fargo Bank or Chase Bank or American Credit Union or whoever, right? I can also write in there as a financing contingency subject to a DSCR ratio of 1.1 or 1.2 per your specific bank. So I had this happen to me one time, one of the earlier properties that I bought. I was using a 20% down DSCR loan. And the purchase price of the property was $380,000. I was going to put 20% down. So I was down, I think it was like $78,000 down, right? And what had happened is the financing, what happened is my interest rate was, they quoted me at 5.5. It ended up being, by the time I was able to get the loan, it ended up being closer to like 5.8, 5.9. This was like end of 2022, if I remember very clearly. And so I had that financing contingency in there, like I always do, with the 5.5 handle on the DSCR loan. And then when the rate shot up, I went to the seller and said, look, this no longer meets the requirements of DSCR with my bank. And so I either need to come up with more money down, which I can't, or I need to lower the purchase price in order for it to satisfy the DSCR ratio, because DSCR is looking at, net operating income versus purchase price. So I either need to boost NOI or I need to lower my purchase price by a little bit in order to satisfy that. And so I was able to go from 380 to 360 with a renegotiated DSCR. But had I not have had that financing contingency in there, I probably would have had to back out of the deal. And that's perfectly fine. The financing contingency allows you to back out of the deal if your desired financing isn't met. But more so, I think it actually can help you in the instance like I was in, where the seller, he was already under contract for a while. Of course, no other investor was going to come and buy it and get the price that he would want to sell it for because of DSCR issues, right? So he just decided to sell it to me. But had I not have had that financing contingency in there, I probably would have been locked in to maybe a subpar deal, or I would have tried to find some other way to back out of the contract. Here's another important one for especially STR investors. STR investors, maybe midterm rental investors too, is permit and license transfer contingency. Let's say you want to buy a property that's a commercial property or some sort of specialized property. Maybe it's a beauty salon permit, liquor license, registration. Maybe it's assisted living. Maybe it's one of these things that goes above and beyond just regular property. Well, are you getting the permit and license to transfer over with you at close? Now, I'm not talking about just for the permit and the license to transfer over. I'm talking about, do you have the contingency to be able to back out if the licenses can't get transferred over, right? So I'll give you an example. When we write contracts, most of the time, I'm writing my contract Ryan Bakey and or assigned. And the and or assigned allows me to transfer that contract into an LLC if I wanted to, into somebody else's name if I wanted to, and it gives me the option to close in my holding companies rather than my personal name. So I always write contracts Ryan Bakey and or assigned. And or assigned is how we write contracts. But let's talk about the permit and license transfer for a second. I went to go buy a property in Hot Springs, Arkansas back in 2022, when at the time, if I remember correctly again, that by the end of that year, they were supposed to have a cap on only 500 total STR permits. And at the time, it was something like 450, 460 were issued. Okay, so I either had to buy a house and hope that the permit gets accepted when they're only giving 40 more out of however many hundreds of houses, right? Wishful thinking. Or I had to buy a house that already was grandfathered in, that already had a permit and license, and get that one to transfer over. See, what happened is the house that I wanted to buy was a 4-unit multifamily property. And it was a multifamily property. Per STR regulations, it needed to have 4 permits. And so I was smart enough to know, well, hey, I better not just buy this property and then hope and pray that I get the permits. I should make the current owner apply for the permits, get all 4 permits, and then we lock in the contract. So I had that in my contract that if the seller could not get the 4 STR permits, that I, Ryan, the buyer, was able to back out of the contract if all those permits were not able to get by the seller and transferred over to me, right? So where else can you do this in, right? If you think about, this is very important in heavily regulated markets, urban markets, Nashville, Florida, Las Vegas, anywhere that's urban that has a city. I think this is super important to make sure that those permits transfer over from the seller to you, and so that way you can continue to operate legally, right? That's the worst thing that can ever happen to you as an STR owner, is to buy a house thinking that you can, thinking that you will be able to rent it out for a lot of money, and then they go ahead and they outlaw STR, or they outlaw midterm rental, and now you're stuck having it as a long-term rental, and you're probably not going to cash flow. I talked about it for a little bit, but the assignment clause, writing the contracts and or assigned, right? So if I write Ryan Bakey and or assigned, then that gives me the right to transfer the contract over to my holding company, an LLC, somebody else. The notice requirement, the buyer or seller must be notified in writing. And there might be assignment fees that go along with it. So let's say I put a property under contract, then I sign it to a private equity partner, and I collect a $15,000 assignment fee. I'm able to do that in certain states as long as I write the contract Ryan Bakey and or assigned. All right, and that's why it's important. If I just write the contract first name, last name, that is not enough. I would then have to get the seller's permission, the lawyer's permission, the realtor's permission in order to change it. If I write that contract Ryan Bakey and or assigned, I already have the rights to assign that to a holding company, to an LLC, to somebody else if I wish to, and so on. So very important that we have that in there. Okay, so putting it all together, right? Here's your contingency checklist for all deals. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is market analysis. Determine if we're in a buyer or a seller market. We have our inspection contingency, right? Appraisal contingency, financing contingency, permit and license transfer contingency, and as well as the assignment clause, the ability to write and draft that contract and or assigned. Stack these clauses into your next purchase agreement addendum so nothing falls through the cracks. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If this episode helped you see how contract contingencies are your best ally, hit subscribe and share it with a fellow investor.